on how to label your questions, and we're going to attempt to gather questions from the audience on the index cards, in part because Jane Katz and I are co-chairs of the Urban Development Work Group, and if we get your thoughts and questions on note cards, it's great input to us as we plan future events, and you'll be hearing more from us about organizing some future events and topics that meet your interests around urban development. So putting things on note cards is just another way that we get some input, because I'm sure in 75 minutes we're not going to address everything there is to say about water and sanitation. So thank you.
Contest, though. How could you say everything about water and sanitation? Yes, 100 words.
If it goes out and pulls in one more
We
person.
have not started.
We're not saying anything yet. Do you want the microphone?
Hello. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. All right, I'll start. And since Tamara already introduced me, I'm Jane Katz from Habitat for Humanity. I do co-chair with Tamara the working group on urban development. And we're going to invite you to do some interesting, innovative things at this session. So since it's urban, just to introduce the area, in 2007, for the first time in history, more people lived in cities and towns than lived in rural areas. By 2050, 70% of the world's population is projected to be living in urban areas. Today, there are roughly 3 billion people living in urban areas, and the inequality in these cities, in many cities, is staggering. Roughly 1 billion of them are living in slums, and in a generation, the number of people living in cities is expected to grow to more than 6 billion people. Because of these challenges, the SID Urban Development Work Group hopes to facilitate lively debate and with knowledgeable and committed professionals in the field, offering a wide range of approaches and views. So our purpose today is to bring together a number of people who are experts in the field to share their experiences. It'll provide an opportunity for you to engage in this area, but we're hoping that the SID working group would also spur your interest in joining our working group, and also to sign up and let us know. And I think Tamara mentioned that if you have index cards that are to be used for questions, but also we'd love to hear from you as to what your interests are going forward for the working group, what types of things you'd be interested in. We do cover a range of activities on disaster resilience, which you've heard about before. We look at disaster response, climate change, housing, slum upgrading, a variety of interests. So the more we hear from you, we can really have some other sessions that are not tied to this forum, but at other points during the year. So I'd just like to introduce today, we're going to be talking about water and sanitation issues, among other public services that we'll be talking about. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Susana Rojas Williams, who works at Habitat for Humanity also, who is an international shelter expert in water and sanitation area, and previously with the United Nations Habitat, which is different from Habitat for Humanity, just to clarify that. And Susana will introduce the panel.
Thank you very much, Jane. And thank you, everybody, for joining us late in the afternoon. Welcome to the panel creating the right institutional and financial framework for sustainable water and sanitation. As most of you know, 2.5 billion people lack access to safe, adequate sanitation, and 780 million people lack access to safe water. So this is a huge challenge. Compounding this challenge, exacerbating these issues, it's urbanization. Cities are growing dramatically at a rate of about 1 million of people per week as people come to the cities in search for economic opportunities, displaced by violence, natural disaster, conflict, and the effects of climate change. Most of this significant growth is going to take place in developing countries. In fact, it's expected that Asia and Africa are going to double in size between 2000 and 2030. And most of these peoples are really coming to slums. Slums in cities that are really not prepared to receive this significant amount of people, not prepared to provide the right amount of services, including water and sanitation. We already have, in sub-Saharan Africa, 62% of the urban living in slums, of urban residents living in slum, and 43% in Central South Asia also living in slums. The densities, the overcrowding situations, the lack of access to sanitation, shared facilities without proper management, the illegal tapping into the public networks, the lack of the inability to really secure the safety of the water. There's no guarantee that the water that those people are accessing are safe, has really created not only a significant health hazard, but also environmental hazards. So how can we address this? These huge challenges really necessitate the articulation of multiple actors and stakeholders, really necessitate the need for different groups to come together. So what we're doing at this panel is we're bringing those different perspectives that come from those different stakeholders. So each of the speakers at this panel today, who I'm going to introduce in a second, bring those different perspectives from the communities, from local government, from corporations, from bilaterals and multilaterals, from utilities. And they're going to be answering the framing questions that each of you have on your handout, on your chair. We're going to have the guided discussions based on those questions. They're going to be answered from the perspective of the particular stakeholder that they are representing. Just a quick comment on the panel. We're going to be asking the same question to each of the speakers, and we're going to give you an opportunity to also give your, for a Q&A right after the first questions. Then we'll go into the second questions, and there will be another Q&A session. So you will have an opportunity to really participate in the discussion. That's where you will be using your index cards. We'll be collecting them. So just to present our speakers, representing the local government and the community perspective, we have Tamara Arsenault. She's the co-chair of the SID Urban Development Working Group and is a program innovations manager at Global Communities. Representing the bilateral perspective and also bringing a very strong sanitation voice will be Anthony Kolb, who is the Urban Health Advisor at USAID. Representing the utility perspective is Nancy Barnes, who is a management consultant at CH2M Hill. And representing the corporate perspective is Gavin Sepelak, Director of International Corporate Volunteerism at Pixera Global. So thank you very much for joining our panel. Before we go right into the questions, we're going to do a bit of, what do they call, energizer. So we're just going to visually look at what the current coverage is in least developed countries. So if you can look at your chair and look at a blue marking right on the top of the chair. All of you with the blue marking, please stand up. We don't have everybody on all the chairs, but you are meant to represent the 60% of people, 60% coverage this, in terms of access to safe water. So you're meant to represent the 60% with access to safe water in least developed countries. Thank you so much. Brown stickers, if you can please stand up. A much smaller group. You are meant to represent the 36% coverage for improved sanitation in least developed countries. So still a very big challenge for sanitation. Thank you. Now, moving into our first question for all the panelists. How can we improve the capacity and financial sustainability of service providers, public, private, or community-based? And how can we encourage greater collaboration?
From the perspective of local government, one of the things I think that it's important is taking a more integrated approach in how we look at water and sanitation within the whole range of service delivery. And so often we get into our sectoral stovepipes and aren't always connecting into the broader financial framework of local government and their ability to generate their own funds. And so I think looking at property tax issues, looking at fee issues related to, in many cases, you have fines for improper disposal of fecal sludge. Yes, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of sanitation in our discussions today. And really looking at the broader framework from the local government perspective in what their role is in financing investments in water and sanitation, I think is a key part of the sustainability question that unfortunately often gets overlooked. And from the community side, I think the sustainability part comes in on the clarity around roles and responsibilities. And we're going to hear the perspectives of different stakeholders here, and quite often the end consumer really has no idea who's responsible at the end of the day for the service delivery. And if they're not satisfied with their public latrine, yelling at the attendant for how awful the conditions are isn't really going to generate change. But is the local government responsible for it? Did the local government contract out with somebody to run this latrine? Is actually my community now running this latrine? So I think understanding too and helping community and community groups understand the institutional framework around how fees are set, how rates are set, and who is actually responsible ultimately for the service delivery, and who's responsible, as Susana mentioned, for the quality of the water and for the quality of the sanitation services that are delivered, I think is critical. So on both the community and the local government side, really information is power. And putting the right information into the right hands of decision makers in a way so that the technocrats have, GIS systems and have an understanding and the data to drive an understanding of knowing what communities actually have public latrine facilities, what communities do or don't have access to water. Are we surprised to find out actually in our experience in a wealthier neighborhood in Accra that there was a lot more open defecation happening where you wouldn't have expected based on income levels. So being sure that the right information is in the hands from the technocrat urban planner side, but that you also have mechanisms like citizen report cards and scorecards and things where the politicians have some accountability and some feedback that allow communities to really voice what their levels of dissatisfaction or not are with the quality of services, I think is a key piece. And then putting that information about where access is or is not back into the hands of the community so they can really advocate for change are two of the factors that we found are very important as far as really driving some of the sustainability around water and service delivery.
Thank you, Tamara. If we can hear the perspective of bilateral.
Oh, that's me? No. I guess representing the bilateral, I'm in a technical bureau within USAID, so I sort of represent the technical too. But in terms of I guess the current USAID perspective in this sector, first of all, I wanted to speak up on sanitation because it's very clear in our relatively recently released water development strategy that sanitation is being prioritized. Particularly from the health side, we've been sort of focusing on sanitation from a technical knowledge management perspective, because not only the 40%, which is the lower level of beneficiaries, but also the concerns about health impacts, which are growing from understanding of the really importance of basic sanitation. But in addition to that, from an urban technical perspective and an urban programming advocate within the agency, it's very important to understand that sanitation is actually on a downward trend. We're losing ground in urban right now. I mean, it's not only that basic sanitation is not, improvements are not keeping up with urban expansion, it's even getting to the point, as you mentioned, open defecation. I mean, I also like to talk about sanitation because you get to say things like that into a microphone. But even open defecation is increasing in urban, which is, it's very rapidly decreasing in rural areas because of some fairly recent innovations in sanitation practice, promotional practice. So sanitation, big for us. Forget about this water supply things. You guys probably you had great success already in that. But the points that I want to make in terms of the question are a little bit more related to programming and I guess perspectives on some of the solicitations that we put out there and the approaches to work that we're seeing to being designed admissions. The first is capacity. You mentioned building the capacity of. For sanitation, it's extremely unclear in many city governments, in many urban areas, who is actually responsible for sanitation, and thus whose capacity should be developed. In the majority of municipal governments that you would interact with in a developing country, their conception of sanitation is garbage collection and disposal. They really don't get into the drainage/sanitation business very often. It just hasn't been put into their mandate. That sits maybe with a health ministry, maybe with a water ministry if they've gotten WASH funding from the donors. But in a typical African country, it's really not much of anywhere. I mean, it's slowly starting to change. This recognition has been out there in the sector for a long time, and people are looking for solutions. But I just came back from Ethiopia, who's had a fairly strong, the government has had a very strong focus on pushing towards universal open defecation-free status in the country, championed by the Ministry of Health. But the Ministry of Health really has modes of working that have not really been adapted yet to urban realities. Ethiopia is still a largely rural country, and they just haven't really been thinking about how you approach implementing work in cities. So the who is still a big question, and finding those champions and finding sort of creative institutional sort of leadership roles is often a big challenge. So we need governance expertise, creative expertise. The financial sustainability for sanitation is also a big problem. Willingness to pay, a basic measure of what you could probably eke out of people's pocketbooks to fund things that they really should be paying for themselves, things like water supply. Pretty easy to get a lot of money for water. People make businesses out of it all over the world. Oftentimes where there is no governance structures, people are just trying to get by, you still get water sellers that pop up because people pay money for it. Sanitation, not so much. And so that really is a huge challenge for financial sustainability. I really don't buy the general revenue, argument. I mean, get some bonds issued and governments will start spending on sanitation. That actually hasn't been shown to be the case in places like India. All kinds of financing available, but not a lot of it going towards shared sanitation facilities. They'd rather build shopping malls and roads and other things, understandably. So it'll always be a big challenge. And in terms of emerging ways to eke out a little bit of revenue from sanitation, what we're starting to fund and what Gates is sort of into is creative private sector participation in this market, a very nascent market. Programs like the Sanergy Group that's working in Nairobi on a sort of a bucket latrine service fee-based model. those are the types of things that are emerging as possible solutions to a pretty dire situation in urban sanitation.
Thank you, Tony. Nancy, if you want to give us a perspective of utilities?
Okay, I'd be delighted to do that. Before I was a consultant, I was a utility manager in New England, so I'm always very proud to represent the utility
Thank
part
you.
in this. Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Where? Uh-oh. I managed
Got a water
Cambridge.
bill complaint?
I managed Cambridge Water Department, and I was executive director of the Bristol County Water Authority in Rhode Island. Anyway, one of the things I've learned over the last 20 years, being outside the United States, is how common the personalities are of people who are running water and wastewater utilities. Most of the people I've run into in the utilities around the world care about what they're doing, they want to do a good job, and they're really proud of the work that they're doing. And it seems to be common if you're a utility manager in the United States or you're in Lusaka, okay? That makes me believe in the people in the industry all around the world, and what I truly believe is if you unlock the potential of those people, they will do the right thing. I have absolutely no doubt. But what does it take to unlock that human potential? Okay. Well, to begin with, every utility, well, it's good to have an enabling environment that effectively allows a utility to do what it needs to do. And that means giving the utility some room to do the right things. In a lot of countries, the utilities are controlled by the ministries. They don't really have any autonomy. They can't make any of their own decisions. They can't set their tariffs. They can't probably purchase anything without some approval. And like a lot of utilities, even in the United States, there's civil service rules that prevent, who you can hire and fire, okay? So the first step is to have a good enabling environment, because then you have a chance to build the utility into a really strong organization. I've been on a lot of projects around the world. I've been on projects to work with a utility, instill all these good values and management principles and all this stuff, but it really doesn't matter because the people at the top won't let these new ideas take root, okay? Now, the next thing is, if you want to get people to change and take action, they have to have some compelling reasons to do that. Now, yes, there are some people in the world who can look at their situation and go, oh my God, we're not serving 100% of our community. We have to get out there and do that. Or if we're going to give people water, we're going to have to give them some kind of wastewater treatment or sanitation. Otherwise, we're just going to create a bigger problem. There are people out there like that. But there maybe aren't 100% of people out there like that. So I think part of it is education, to get people to understand the connection between all these moving parts and give them some kind of incentives for doing the right thing. Another piece is to hold people accountable, and you touched on this, Tamara, with the public and what they're demanding. But it's also true within a utility that whoever the leadership of the utility is to have plans, set goals for people, hold them accountable for achieving those goals, okay, to give them compelling reasons to take action. And then the third piece to this is once people are motivated and they have a good enabling environment, then what I believe they need is access to the knowledge, tools, skills, and resources they need to make some progress. And to me, that's not so hard. It's not so hard. There are plenty of books written on all kinds of management topics, on metering, on non-revenue water reduction. And as long as I think you give people access to the information they need, they'll pick it up and run with it. So I think we're not maybe giving enough credit to the people who are working in the utilities around the world. And if we do, and we create the right set of circumstances for them, I really believe that they will take the ball and run with it.
Thank you, Nancy. Gavin, for the perspective from the corporate sector.
Great, thanks everybody. So I think I bring a little bit different perspective. I know nothing about water and sanitation, so I'm outnumbered here. A lot of knowledge to my right. But I do work with a lot of corporations at Pixar Global, from IT firms, pharmaceutical companies, and specifically in this instance, kind of food and beverage companies. You know, what can the private sector do to help, you know, service providers build capacity, sustainability? I think the food and beverage companies can do quite a bit, especially those that have large stakes in developing countries or developing markets where they want to expand. PepsiCo is one of those companies. They use tons and tons of water in their manufacturing facilities. You know, that's just, it's bad CSR, it's bad corporate citizenship to use all that and, you know, suck it out of the community, not give it back, not put back into the community. So a lot of corporations and what they're doing and what they can do, and I'll give an example of what PepsiCo is doing through their program called PepsiCore, is that they're giving back to the community. They are able to take their skills, their individuals, their most valuable assets, and then the knowledge of the corporates, the corporation, their IT. You know, Nancy talked about, you know, the information and the need and the skills and giving those to the people that need that. Corporations have those. They have internal materials. They have, you know, inventions. They have things that they've created that they want to distribute and build the capacity of, whether it's a local water board in the Volta region in Ghana, or it's a small village in India and helping with their kind of rainwater catchment and distribution system there. So they have the capability to do that. And why they're doing this, you know, it's kind of a triple win situation. Corporates like PepsiCo, they're learning to build brand recognition on the ground, understanding what the actual issues are, you know, how they're going to build the capacities within these, you know, water boards or local governments and communities, is to really understand the issues on the ground and what their needs are. And hopefully they can fill those gaps where they're not receiving the funding from, say, a bilateral like USAID, or not receiving the money from a local government, but they can go in there and, you know, patch up and, you know, help build the community. I'll end on one example. You know, PepsiCo had a team of 10 corporate employees from around the world in the Volta region, working with the Water and Sanitation Board there. And what the issue was, you know, the communities had access to water, but what they lacked is resource management and how to operate efficiently and effectively. So they identified the weaknesses, and then, you know, through a month-long assignment, they were able to deliver the Water Sanitation Board with new processes on how to better manage the distribution of the water, but also to involve the community. They established a hotline for community members to provide feedback and a reporting system on the issues, giving, you know, the local community and the people a voice into what's happening. So I'll hand it back over.
Thank you for your answers. If we have any questions from the audience, we're ready to collect some of those index cards.
Just show hands.
Or if you want to come close to the microphone, that will be helpful
There
too.
are two,
Oh.
Susana.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Ben Mann from Tetra Tech. Thanks for all of those comments. It was interesting to hear all the wide variety of thoughts that you had to share coming from lots of different backgrounds, which is interesting because as we're talking about sustainability, there are lots of stakeholders and different views and different users and contributors that you have to take into account. And one of the things that I think Gavin brought up right at the very end there that I'd like to hear a little bit more thoughts on is all of the data that is being brought up on providing water and sanitation services. It's pretty crucial to how we monitor sustainability. There's all sorts of tools that have been developed in recent years for how you do monitoring of sustainability. I know that Tony's probably familiar with about 50 off the top of his head of different ones, but there's still a gap in how we're applying all of that data, how we're closing the feedback loops, and how we're incorporating that into the way that we can better program so that we don't have declines in coverage, so that we are actually keeping up with growth rates. So I'd love to just hear a little bit more of your insights on how we can do a better job of leveraging all that information and data that our projects are generating.
We're going to have 3 questions and then wait for the answers. If we have any more questions.
I can respond.
Gretchen McCusker, Technologist Inc. This is a question about best practices in water. So I've always felt that a lot of the best practices in the US is basically at the water utilities. And I've always been frustrated by the fact that most of the expertise, of course you have Nancy, but that person like Nancy who's gone from a water utility to international development is really rare. So most of our expertise is actually sitting in our water utilities, and those people actually don't get out and contribute to international problems. So one of the things I've thought about a lot is how to get these people that are the practitioners of our American water best practices out and solving some of these international problems. Thank you.
I can take that one.
Hello, my name is David Baxter from the Institute of Public-Private Partnerships. One of the issues that we always find when you're looking at public-private partnerships is the return on investment. And in many countries, they have poor water policies which don't encourage payment for water. It's almost a sense that the water is free, and that is a deterrent to investors because they know they're not going to make any money if they enter into that financial partnership. And I was just wondering what your opinion was on making everyone pay for water no matter what their financial situation is.
Thank you for your questions. If the panelists can respond to the questions.
Yeah, I can start, I guess, on data. I'm a Luddite, I admit it. I'm a little bit anti-technology right now for a couple of reasons. And it's basically because when you actually go into the field and understand the realities that many of the focus countries that we're working in today are, I mean, there's a lot of variety, of course, and certainly working in the Middle East is nothing like working in Liberia right now. But regular power supply, any ability to use any data in a decision-making process is extremely limited because if you're putting out fires every minute of your day, you don't really have a lot of time to do analytical work. And you certainly don't have people that see it as their job to do that. So, I think we can get way too far ahead on certain technical approaches and be pushing way too hard. And based on some applications of various tools, GIS, for example, there's been probably a huge overinvestment in GIS because it's a fancy tool that you can ask a consultant to implement for somebody, and if there's no demand for it, it will sit on the shelf just like any report that a consultant writes. A water quality monitoring system that if there's not really effective regulation, you can collect all kinds of water quality data, but it'll never be used in any sort of way. So I'm just a little bit cautious about getting too far ahead on some of these new tools and applications without understanding the processes that really critically would drive their use and really understanding the client. And I guess I just wanted to make a comment in relation to our colleagues working in the water utility space. As a donor or as a provider of pro bono services, I worry at times that we're getting in the way of what should be a market-driven process. Where water, if the politics will allow it, can be sold quite profitably. And thus, any water utility should be able to operate like a business. And they should, if they need advice on how to save energy costs or reduce the leaks and thus improve their bottom line, they should be able to do that in the free market. rather than us sort of stepping in and creating barriers to actually having a market for consultancy services. So I think we have to be very careful about looking at the context and saying when enough is enough in providing free technical assistance, and instead trying to encourage those indigenous capacities at the local level to provide that knowledge and have concentrated expertise in countries, because that is really a sustainable solution to continual improvement and expansion of services in a profitable area, which is water supply.
I just wanted to follow up on the data side, and I mean, I think there is a challenge in the ability to maintain and sustain it, though I think there's great variability in the local context and understanding what the incentives and the motivation are. I mean, I think, we partner together in Liberia, and I think there is a real challenge and a real question on the long-term sustainability for some of the work going forward on the community-led total sanitation. The World Bank, others have invested a lot of excellent work in mapping, sanitation points, mapping water points, and there's real concern and real questions over whether the National Technical Coordinating Unit really has the capacity and the technical ability to sustain that going forward. But I do think in other, so Liberia is sort of maybe one end of the spectrum, but I do think, we are seeing some positive steps and the real ability to sustain investments that, and technical assistance that we have provided with USAID funding, or in some cases Gates Foundation funding in Ghana, for example, where you're at a different level of development, a different level of capacity of some of the technical employees at the city government level. And when you invest in GIS systems that are tied into local government revenue, then there is an incentive for them to maintain those systems. And so, of course, it was easier to do it on a city scale of 500,000 people, Sekondi Takoradi, not as overwhelming as some of the major metropolitan areas in other sub-Saharan African countries. But the street addressing process that we supported the city to do was very much linked to some of the early, and they were able to do that, linked to some of the earlier work we had helped them with on poverty mapping, slum mapping, and really using GIS to understand where was the need for investment. If you don't know what part of your city does or doesn't have what service, it's always the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, and it's always the wealthiest communities that keep demanding more resources. And yes, even when you do know, there's not always the political will to act on that data. But I think when the data is tied to property revenues, and we helped the city map every single residence and business and increase by 72% the property tax registry. And that's leading to a 30% increase in their property tax revenue, which is real resources that they're going to then be able to invest back into the community. And of course, in part, and it's kind of foreshadows our next topic, which is the regulatory framework, in part we were able to make some of that behavior change happen at the city level, I think, because there were, there's a performance-based grant mechanism at the national government level, which doing things in a more transparent way, doing things with greater citizen engagement, helped the city score points that allowed it to get greater grant resources out of the national government performance-based grant system. So I do think when you have a framework from the national level down that also helps drive incentives, and when you have city government seeing that investing in the systems has a return on investment, and you bring the community into that discussion, because there was real fear, right? If we start putting an address and a name on all of these streets, won't I have to pay more taxes? And once, communities were part of the discussion, though, that the poorest of the poor would not actually have to, I think you began to see how the system could be sustained. And we'll be looking to see if other cities catch on once they've seen how well Sekondi Takoradi is doing. But I do think there's hope when it's tied into that type of financial incentive.
Nancy or Gavin, if you would like to answer to one of the questions.
I'd like to answer the best practices one. Okay. Are you familiar with the UN Habitat Global Water Operator Partnerships Program? WOPA, okay. Water Operator Partnership, for those of you who don't know, brings together a water utility in a developed country together with one in a lesser developed country to work on an issue. Non-revenue water is a great one. It's a common one for these partnerships. It's not a full-time thing. It's usually periodic visits by the developed utility to the country and coaching and, you know, remote communications. They've had this program for some time now, and they are in contact with the American Waterworks Association International Council. At the same time, the U.S. Water Partnership is thinking about having a utility strengthening initiative, and one of my goals for this year is to kind of connect all the dots and bring everybody together so that there can be water operator partnerships that pair up U.S. utilities with utilities in other countries. Caribbean is probably the first place they would start, just as a proof of concept. I love this idea. And then expand it beyond the Caribbean. There's actually been one between Contra Costa, California and Belize that's worked very well, so it's a good model to begin with. But this is a way to bring U.S. utilities into the mix. The challenge for that, however, even though there are probably loads of people in U.S. utilities who would love to go on one of these things, is the public perception. Now, having been a utility manager, I know that, you know, this is the kind of thing that the local newspaper would love to grab and kill you for, okay? So there has to be some real thinking among the parties about how to position it. And then the other issue that's come up in my discussion with some of the utilities is the idea that, well, you know, security, we can't be bringing people from other countries into our utilities, okay? Which probably a legitimate concern. So when my kind of role is to help the U.S. utilities think through how they could do this and then try to get it all, you know, schmoozed around so we can do it.
Let me ask a question to Nancy. How does sister cities, does that ever play a role with, is that ever used as a tool to other?
Thanks for that idea.
Yeah.
I'll put that into the mix.
I mean, I can say I know from having done some work with sister cities that yes, and ICMA also often does and facilitates study tours through, you know,
ICMA.
right.
That's very big.
Right, because, you know, city manager's got his or
Right.
her connections into the whole network of the utility sphere, so.
Yeah.
If one of the panelists could answer the question on return on investments, short answer so we can move into the second framing question.
Maybe I can take the private sector perspective of that. I mean, private sector is always trying to measure the return on investment, whether they're putting money or, you know, people down on the ground. But from what we're seeing is that it's always hard to measure. But, you know, just making kind of the softer stuff, making those connections to the, you know, the local ministries or local organizations and so on, understanding the needs on the ground and actually maybe coming back with a few new product ideas, whether it is single-serve water, kind of sachets for an organization in Ghana, or is it you know, learning about other opportunities or products they can provide to their target market there. Obviously, return on investment too. If companies are sending skilled employees over, you know, building those leadership abilities of those employees, turning into global leaders, so they understand the problems globally within, you know, the community, with the municipalities, and so on. So they're, as a corporation, they're better understanding the global issues.
Maybe just one other comment on the return on investment question, because it was related to, you know, governments are giving water away for free. I mean, I do think there, and in part, the MDGs did help. I think the whole focus on sustainable service delivery and improved access. I think, you know, at least the trend we're seeing is that there's a moving away from that and a recognition that all of the research shows that the poor actually pay 3 to 10 times more than the wealthy for their water. So this idea that, the government, by setting a policy of, subsidizing or having it for free, what it means is that they're underinvested and the actual extension of service doesn't ever happen. And so, haphazard arrangements, stealing of water, other things take place, or private vendors, great for the entrepreneurs that are, filling an unmet need. But in fact, the poor end up paying 3 to 10 to 12. It depends on what country, what context, in a much higher actually price for water. So I do think there is a shift going on where there's a recognition perhaps in the pricing and a recognition of coming up with, smarter ways of doing that. I don't know if you're as hopeful, Tony. No.
Well, there's certain public services that are just inherently more political, and water, in the utility realm, water is always the one that I would never invest in most political contexts. I mean, I would go for telecom, and that's where the billionaires are, because there's no perception of that we need to subsidize telecom. But there is a strong commitment to subsidizing some basic services like water supply in particular. So that's always going to be part of the, and if you're a donor or if you're in the private sector, you just have to look for those windows of reform opportunity, and they come for different reasons, because of changes in leadership or some trends or regional sort of perspectives on things as they change, and we just have to be intelligent about following those.
Thank you. We're going to move into the second framing question, and we'll have another opportunity for Q&A. So our second question for all the panelists is, how does the second Q&A? How does the regulatory and institutional framework affect the long-term sustainability of service delivery?
Well, I mean, one point that we sort of touched on already is the lack of clarity, and I think this particularly comes in the sanitation sector. Water as well. When people aren't clear whose responsibility is, then it's a real disincentive to invest. And in many cases, you have utility legislation that, for example, in Ghana, that gave urban water infrastructure to the Ghana Water Company. So almost no matter who invested in it, the actual physical infrastructure was under the ownership, or seemed to be under the ownership, of the utility itself. Whereas the rural areas were covered by the Community Water and Sanitation Agency. And then you had this large space called peri-urban, where a lot of the informal settlements were developing, that was no man's land. And it was really nobody's responsibility to provide service, because it fell outside the two government providers. And then you had this sort of, lack of clarity around what was the role of municipal government in, if a city invested in physical infrastructure, did the ownership go to the utility? Because that's sort of what the law said. So then why would the city want to invest if it couldn't control it? And so that, I think, lack of clarity around who's responsible for the service delivery versus who's responsible for ensuring the quality versus who's responsible for the tariff and rate setting, the murkiness of that picture for water services versus sanitation services, and the then lack of of clarity for the consumer about how is my rate calculated, and also sort of lack of understanding of the other side's perspective. And some of the things that come out of when you have dialogues that bring stakeholders together and people can understand and put themselves in the shoes of the utility, and sort of, the utility saying, well, in the case of Sekondi Takoradi, you have a huge amount of illegal mining operations going on. And so, the reason there's not water pressure is because the dam reservoir is reduced because these illegal miners are diverting it. And all of a sudden you saw the role for actually the police enforcing, the removal of the illegal miners was really affecting the water pressure. Something that communities had no, really understanding of how interconnected all of these things are. And when people understand that their neighbor who's invested in the pump that they're hiding in their bedroom, that they've illegally tapped into the network, which is sucking water into their own private reservoir, and everybody downstream from that now has no water pressure, when a community understands how all of those individual local actions are affecting them collectively, you can really start to see some of the same things we see in microfinance, in peer sort of lending operations. You can really see some peer pressure and some people willing to sort of rat out their neighbors about the fact that this is affecting the quality of service for all of us. And so I think when helping people understand, it's very complex and it takes time to really help people understand the complexity of the regulatory framework, but putting it in terms that people can understand and helping them understand the perspective of other players and stakeholders really, I think, ends up leading to some creative, collaborative problem solving instead of, some of the just sort of bashing, well, you are illegally stealing the water and that's the problem, and you utility, never deliver, and you bring people together and you help them see each other's side, and it's amazing how actually creative solutions can come out of that.
Thank you. The perspective of the bilateral and sanitation sector.
Well, again, I guess I'll speak on behalf of being an urbanist within a bilateral.
Not always easy.
Yeah, no, excellent point, Sarah. I think the general point that I like to make, though, in the water supply and sanitation development world, there's a huge rural bias in just sort of the definition of terms, and when you start thinking about institutional frameworks in particular. Urban is oftentimes in your typical policy that your UNICEF consultant will come in and develop for an African country, and then they'll adopt because they're not going to do it. There is some sort of special urban section maybe, but the real concentration, the metrics of success and so forth, are designed for looking at your sort of typical rural community. And the complexities of working with the different institutions that are responsible for urban services oftentimes are just beyond the understanding of that UNICEF consultant as they design the policy. And also a recognition that, in general, rural development approaches tend to be sort of uniform. You get, we're going to have X in the district office, you have one focal point for WASH, and you have X number of clinics within the district serving X number of people. It's sort of this cookie cutter approach to community development that takes hold. What is very unique about urban environments typically is they're all really, really different. You're working in an oil boom city that has a totally different history of local administration from Accra. So you can't really probably use the same solutions or institutional framework necessarily in one city in Ghana versus another. I mean, Kumasi then, totally different institutional reality there. There's just been so much that's happened from the point of the growth and inception of these cities to where sort of we are today, that the solutions really have to be quite adaptable and different. And so that is a huge challenge. I just wanted to mention one other thing on the regulatory side that needs to be recognized as unique in urban as well. I think, again, there's oftentimes this fallback on community level institutions, or talk to the local chief and then you'll get everybody to adhere to a new behavior. Those types of community-based approaches in urban can sort of work sometimes, but they're usually much more unique and again, adapted to the realities of what the social environments, how they're put together. They're not very standard, and they change from community to community, even within a city, a lot. So there's just a higher level of demand and understanding of sort of creative approaches to working in urban environments on these types of issues when it comes to institutions and it comes to effective regulations. Because I think the other thing that we may not want to hear or talk about too often is that regulation in the sense of fining individuals like we do here in the United States for many, many things. I don't think we like to talk about too much when we're talking about our beneficiaries and the poor. But there certainly is scope for being hard-nosed about regulation at the individual level when it comes to sanitation, for example. I mean, we talk a lot about regulation of the water utility, those evil money grabbers that we have to control the tariffs and so forth. But we don't talk so much about the importance of clear and workable regulations that can be enforced to sort of incrementally improve the situation when it comes to sanitation. I think we need to be more sophisticated about that.
Well, just one point on that is that in many cases, and it was mentioned in the luncheon panel about the importance of standards, but the challenge often is the enforcement. I mean, there's many lovely building codes in many countries around the world and many standards that make it clear that a landlord legally cannot lease or rent out a property if they haven't provided adequate sanitation. And yet, without the enforcement mechanism and without getting the incentives right for local government officials to, to take action on what in many cases are, wealthy landlords who have, multiple properties, having the standards on the books doesn't ensure that it gets enforced. And that's where I think, that's where I do think community mobilization and putting pressure and making people aware of what the law is and, looking for that enforcement and demanding that enforcement is a part of the solution.
Right, actually actively engaging in changing these regulations into workable arrangements that push for incremental change. I mean, again, I think in urban, there's a general sense that everything should be perfect like it was back in the colonial days for those couple of people that lived in the city and serviced the Europeans. Instead of looking at the realities of city life today in, say, in Africa, and
what can we do in the margin?
What can be done to incrementally improve that?
Mm-hmm. Nancy, the perspective of utilities.
Okay. Utilities. Now, some people may not have been alive then, but okay. US EPA came into existence in 1972. Okay, and started with regulation of the water and wastewater sectors in the United States. And at first everybody thought it was terrible. But now, I know when I go into my hotel last night, I'm in Washington, D.C., I know it's regulated. I can turn on the faucet and drink that water and it's not going to make me sick. That is huge. I want to ask every one of you, next time you turn on the faucet and drink water, you can thank EPA for knowing that it's safe for you to drink. And if it's not, they have 24 hours to let you know.
24 hours.
But that's huge if you think about it, especially in developing countries. If you could do that in developing countries, how great it would be for public health and people's sense of well-being, if you will. Now, the other side to regulation is also tariff regulation, or rate setting, as we call it here in the United States. And at first, a utility, you might think that that's a terrible thing, but in fact, if you can state your case that this is the amount of money I need to do the job, and these are the rates that we need to charge, and the regulator approves them, that gives the public some sense of security that you're not ripping them off, that you're asking for what you need, no more, no less, with maybe a reasonable return on investment if you're a private company. And so I've never really looked at a regulator, an economic regulator, as being a bad thing, or a quality regulator either. But this is not an attitude, I think, that's widely shared by utility managers around the world, because a regulator can seem like a threat. You know, I'm going to get in trouble if I don't meet the standards. Okay? Now, in Egypt, USAID's had projects in Egypt for many, many years. And there have been some really great things that have happened there in the last, 5 to 10 years, in terms of reforming the whole setup of the sector, forming the holding company for water and wastewater, which creates some, fairly autonomous, what did we say? Fairly autonomous water and wastewater companies. Okay? Also formed a regulator. Then there was a new Ministry of Water formed, and the regulator went into the Ministry of Water. Now, this is all in the context of the Egyptian Revolution. The regulator became essentially, I'll say it, somebody might disagree, became the research arm for the new minister. Well, then the change in government came, and now the Ministry of Water is gone. and I don't really know what happened to the regulator. But in other words, I'm bringing this up because it was really a nice setup. All the right balance, you know, checks and balances in the sector, but somehow or another there was really a lack of appreciation for what the role of the regulator was and how the regulator could actually help to improve the sector. Okay? So I think it's a great concept. It's worked really well in the United States. I think if we can get it to take hold in other countries, it would be great, especially combined with the public participation. But I'm not totally hopeful that it's going to happen easily or soon. Yeah.
Thank you. Gabby?
I think we're running close on time, right? We're going to leave some questions, so I'll be quick. I mean, from a private sector perspective, you know,
You don't like regulation?
I think, you know, very straightforward, and on your point is that, you know, we want, you know, friendly and, you know, a conducive environment where the private sector can get involved, can contribute new ideas, make things more efficient and so on, especially in the communities where they're operating, whether it's here in the U.S., whether it's emerging markets, or, you know, markets where they have interest in expanding and so on. You know, I think one of the most important things, and we've talked about it through all of us, is, you know, what makes, you know, these programs or water boards or, you know, the ministry is sustainable and efficient. It's collaboration, right, through a number of parties. So, you know, the private sector wants to get involved with the local community. They want to get involved with the government. They want to see an impact. They want to make sure their resources are making an impact on the greatest amount of people as possible. So I think a friendly, open mindset, especially with the governments, but also, you know, when we're, you know, looking at, you know, bilaterals and multilaterals, coordinating with them and providing extra technical assistance to those ministries, organizations, they're providing funding assistance too. So, so that's all I got.
Thank you. We have an opportunity for another 3 questions. Please. And I'm going to start with one, because an aspect that was mentioned in the first question, but I don't think we address as strongly, was about collaboration. So we have this group of stakeholders here representing different perspectives, but I would love to know more from your experience what hinders and what supports collaboration among all of you. And I think Nancy had some ideas. Next question.
My name is Lee Roussel. I started my career working with Tamara at the Office of Housing and Urban Development at USAID. And we were very optimistic that we were going to change the water sector all over the world through payments by individual households. Well, I never heard of that happening, did you? So my question is, I know that the US has not succeeded in doing this. I know the World Bank over a decade ago did an evaluation of the water sector and said, this is our least successful sector. So what was their conclusion? Ramp down the funding for what is clearly, everybody in this room thinks it's an important sector, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Do we know of any more successful donor efforts or programs that have gotten over what Tony told us, that in the regulatory structure, it's only too easy to see that government is unwilling to do what they need to do. It's just too politically difficult to ask for the recipients of the water, the participants in the water system, to pay enough so that there is enough water and sanitation delivered. Do we have any good examples?
Thank you. Any more questions?
I wanted to ask a question about Egypt. So obviously managing the water in Egypt is important, but we have to think about as well where it comes from. And you have a variety of very poor, water-scarce countries drawing any water they have from the Nile, that one source. So I wanted to ask, maybe for Mr. Kolb, as the USAID is a sister agency of the State Department, what is the role of diplomacy or international regulations on justly managing these types of crises where multiple countries are interested in the same source of water?
Thank you. We have roughly about 8 minutes to end the session, so I'll give each of you 2 minutes each.
Well, 2 minutes. Well, had he been available, Lee, there would have been another voice from the past, Eddie Perez, from the Water and Sanitation Program at the World Bank, who unfortunately was traveling, and I was really interested in having Eddie share some of the really, I think, interesting impact evaluations and research that they have been doing on what's working well and some of the experimentation. So Eddie's not here. There are some really great case studies and actually wonderful summaries of some of the impact evaluations that the World Bank Water and Sanitation Program has funded on their website, very accessible. And one of the things I am trying to find out more about, so I'm curious if anybody in the audience has an actual full-on evaluation of it, is the Maji Voice experience in Kenya that the World Bank Water and Sanitation Program invested in together with the utility, and it really is putting a lot more, using technology, information where people can, through their, doesn't have to be smartphone, through flip phone, simple, SMS, send feedback on quality, on people illegally tapping, on, they're looking at, of course, Kenya's sort of the primo place to be able to do mobile money transactions, paying your utility bill, using mobile money. It's a great Maji Voice, M-A-J-I. I'm sure it means something that
Water.
Thank you. I don't speak Swahili. I should have known that, though. You can, go on the website and you can track your bill. I mean, there's a lot that is some interesting applications that are happening now. What I haven't seen is a full-on evaluation of the impact. It's more sort of promotional on the side about how that's working as far as linking the technology and people into then helping drive better service delivery on the water side.
Thank you.
How quickly, because wine is waiting. Collaboration works when there are clear common interests that can be operationalized at low transaction costs. So water operating partnerships, I was just speaking with one of our partners in Sub-Saharan Africa who's promoting partnerships. They're not going to be going to Asia anytime soon. That's a little bit too costly for them. They're starting regionally. And oftentimes they have much more similar interest in many ways. The politics are the same, et cetera. But I think there has been great success in water. Urban water supply, even to the poor, is expanding globally, and really rapidly in places like China, of course, where governments have decided to make major investments in infrastructure expansion. And water is usually a pretty high priority. It's a high priority for a lot of donors, too. So there's quite a bit of money out there. There's lots of private sector interest and even potential in some places. And cities like Manila, who have done a fabulous job of really expanding very rapidly into poor urban spaces, utilizing their indigenous capacity with a little bit of outside support. So there's a lot of success stories in water. It's really sanitation, which is a little bit more of a concern. On the water conflict between countries, I often push back a little bit on this issue when it relates to water supply, because it's never about domestic water supply that these sorts of issues come up, with a few extreme exceptions where we're quite active in those countries that border Israel, in that region, where water is extremely scarce. But generally, water conflicts are over economic development issues, hydropower, agriculture, the big users of water, rather than domestic water supply. So, typically countries, it's not an issue of fighting with their neighbors or trying to get water to the urban poor. Those are different issues at play.
Nancy?
Okay, since I have a short time, I'll just make it a little bit fun. So in one of my days working as a utility manager, I had a customer call who insisted on speaking to me and no one else. He was very angry, was yelling and yelling. I had finally learned to just be quiet while people yell, and they'll, blow themselves out a little bit. He got all finished and he said, "Aren't you going to say anything?" And I said, "Well, I have a question for you." He said, "What's that?" I said, "How much do you pay for cable television?" a month. He said $42. In the meantime, I'd been able to look up his bill, and his water bill for 3 months was $120, so he was paying less for water than for his utilities. I said, well, that's more than you're paying for water. Well, I shouldn't have to pay for water at all. It comes from the sky. I said, well, that's right, sir. It is free. So you're welcome to go out to the reservoir and take as many containers as you want and fill them up and bring them home. But if you wanted to have it delivered to your home, safe to drink, you're going to have to pay for it. And the guy said, I'm sorry. I apologize. That makes all the sense in the world. So this is a little bit of a story, and I actually told it to the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Water, something or other, in Mauritius. And she said, we could say that to people? I said, sure. It gets the point across. Anyway.
Thank you.
I can relate to that. I lived in Morocco for 2 years. The water was free, but I had to purchase a donkey and go down the well every day and bring up the water. And thank God they finally, right when I left, they got taps right next to the house. So I would have paid for that. But just wrapping up, I think we talked about collaboration and the challenges. I think one thing with the private sector and for us to relate to the public sector is that, hey, we need to get something out of it too. We can make a profit by also doing good at the same time. So that's something that needs to be understood across the board. But also, there's also trying to find, I think, common ground between the communities, the aid development agencies, and so on. Is all right. Companies have their interests, their emerging markets. From what our experience, Brazil, India, China, South Africa are very popular. A lot of companies don't want to go to Rwanda or other countries that aren't a big market for them, whether it's food products or technology and so on. So it's finding that overlap and then making that overlap succeed and making sure the challenge or the need is coming from the ground up.
I think this may be a first one. We're 1 minute to spare. And I would like to thank our speakers in the panel. Thank you very much for your participation. And I would like to thank our audience. Thanks for joining us at this session this late in the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you have our emails, so on the handout. And so if you've got a question that you want to follow up, you know how to reach us. And if you can bring your index cards or leave them on the table up here, we'd like to collect those. As I said, we'll be planning future urban development work group events, and we'd love to respond to more of this. And I can see a definite sanitation discussion in our future. So thank you again.
Oh, my God.
Before and after I joined.
Were you in Rhode Island, in Bristol County?
Oh,
Okay.
thanks.
So that's why I can't find one, because I keep asking people, and I keep, do you know anything more about it? It sounds really cool, but I believe it when I see it.
No.
Yeah, we work with them.